Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brigitte, and I'm the owner and founder of San Diego Seed Company. We are a small seed company located here in Southern California, and we focus primarily on regionally adapted seeds and organic seeds for the urban and small-scale farmer. So it is my pleasure to present to you guys a presentation about seed starting. Seed starting is one of the most incredible skills that you can learn that can help you become a really avid gardener or farmer and provide a lot of food for your family and your community. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen here and you guys will be able to see the presentation. I'm going to go through it step by step so that you guys can see that seed starting is really actually not that difficult. It just comes down to knowing the key things that can go wrong and trying to figure out how to not do those things. So here we have it. So your garden, whether it be your small scale garden in pots or whether it's you're a thriving gardener turning into an urban farmer or even an urban farmer that sells produce at farmers markets, your garden starts with seeds, and it is the most economical way to start your garden, and it is also the way in which you can get the most diversity. Buying starts from a nursery can be pretty expensive, and so by starting your seeds, you can have a garden that costs a lot less. So I'm going to go through every single step, what I've learned for the years and years and years that I have been a professional seed starter, and all of the things that I have found out that makes the process a lot easier. So first, I want to talk about, obviously this presentation is geared specifically towards San Diegans. And along with seed starting, I also want to talk a little bit about other things that are really going to make you a successful grower. And one of those is understanding our seasons. We have two primary seasons in Southern California, zones 9 and 10, and that's warm season and cool season. And as you can see from the graphic that that we have created for you, warm season expands most of the months of the year. And as you can imagine, warm season is a time in which the weather is warmer, but it is not just that. It's also when the days are longer. And so there are certain plants that like to grow in those conditions. Conversely, you have cool season, and cool season is the time of year when the days are a little bit shorter. They're either shorter getting longer or longer getting shorter. Either way, they are shortening. And the temperatures are cooler, and if you're lucky enough, you live in an area that might get some rain. We don't get a whole lot, but what rain we do get is predominantly in the cool season. So if you look at the graphic here, you can see that the cool temperature, the median cool temperature in January is hovering around 50. So it's not very cold, but it's definitely a lot cooler than the highs in the warm season, which can get up to 77 and on up. If you are in the inland valleys and the desert, those high heat temperatures can get even hotter. So this is a really cool graphic. We have it available on our website. We post it on Instagram and Facebook all the time. It is yours to utilize so that you can understand what grows when. You'll notice also in this graphic that there's a little section called shoulder season. And shoulder season is basically when we're kind of in limbo in between the two seasons. As you become an expert grower, you'll learn how to handle these shoulder seasons and what you can grow and what you can't, and then the techniques that you can use to further make those to make those seasons even more beneficial to you, meaning having a longer lettuce season or a longer tomato season, whatever your desire is. So very cool graphic. I highly recommend that you check it out. I want to talk a little bit about terminology before we jump into the seed starting. Annual versus perennial. The reason why it's important to me that we discuss this is because when you live in Southern California, particularly in very mild areas like Zone 10, you notice that annual and perennial doesn't really make as much sense as if you live, say, in Kansas, where plants definitely are either an annual or a perennial. The reason being is Southern California's temperatures are so mild, especially if you live near the coast, that a lot of plants can perennialize and live for multiple seasons. So An annual is a plant that will live for one season, and a perennial is a plant that will live for multiple seasons. Most, if not all, vegetable crops are typically annuals. However, in Southern California, we have this beautiful thing called perennialization. That's when something that is typically an annual actually turns into a perennial because our temperatures are so mild. You see this a lot with tomatoes. This happens because tomatoes, can grow well through the winter. They're not as productive, but they can grow. And then in the spring, they start giving their tomatoes again. So that's what those terms mean. And it's also important to know that there's a lot of crops that can easily be grown year round. And it's important that we take advantage of those. I will list those for us. The other thing that I want to talk about is this something called the Wild Plant Agreement. And this sounds very interesting. You're probably thinking, what is she talking about? Basically, the Wild Plant Agreement is an agreement that happened eons ago when man decided to take wild plants and cultivate them to make the food crops that we now have today. And I don't know if this actually happened, but this is what I can imagine happened. The man or woman, most likely a woman, but could be a man, goes to the wild plant and makes an agreement with them and says, look, wild plant, I will fertilize you and stake you and water you and protect you and do everything I need so that you can give me luscious, amazing fruits or foliage or whatever it is that we're trying to eat. The reason why I want to mention this is the big differentiation between wild plants and cultivated plants. Wild plants, if you've ever had like a wild tomato, they're very small, not very tasty. The plants are massive. Sometimes they're really spiny. There's all these things that make them less desirable for us to eat as humans. Over our time span, we have cultivated those to become more and more delicious, high in sugar, easier to harvest, all of these different things. So that is what the Wild Plant Agreement is. And the reason why I mention it is because as you are gardening, it's something to think about. Think about how you can provide that plant with everything that it needs to have to be as happy as possible and give you as much fruit or foliage or blooms that you want. That's basically essentially our job as gardeners and farmers. So I do want to mention all of the different crops that you can grow year-round in San Diego County. Now, again, this will depend where you are in San Diego County. If you are up in higher elevations, this is probably not the case. But most of us closer down here to the coast, you definitely can grow these year-round. Tomatoes, chard, rhubarb, chayote squash is a really good one. Fennel will grow and reseed and grow and reseed. The bulbs can get massive, season after season. Collards is another one. We actually have a tree collard on our farm that is taller than I am because it's been growing for 4 years now. And we just keep harvesting from it. It's really incredible. Peppers, you can see pepper plants that almost look like bushes. Onions and many dark leafy greens you can grow year round in San Diego. So take advantage of the fact that we can do that. All right, now without further ado, let's talk about seed starting. Seed starting falls into the category of plant propagation. Propagation is any way in which you take a plant and you increase the number of those plants, and you can do it several different ways. One of the ways I'm going to talk about is seed starting. And most of the time when we think about seed starting, we're thinking about seed starting in trays or any container. And we do that for a couple different reasons. The upside is that it's very cost effective. So you can buy a $4 pack of seeds, you can buy a $10 tray and a $5 bag of soil. And with that, you could potentially produce 100, 200, 300 plants, which is really incredible. So it's very cost effective to start your own plants. When you're starting from seed, you also have a very wide range of seed stock or genetics available to you. You know that when you go to the nursery and you're looking at the tomato plants, you may only have 5 different varieties to choose from. But there's thousands of varieties of tomatoes, hundreds of thousands of varieties of tomatoes available in the universe. And if you are planting from seed, if you go through a seed catalog, you'll see that most seed catalogs have a tomato section that's rather large. And there's varieties that you may have never even heard of that you can start from seed. So it's just a really neat way to have a very diverse garden. Some of the downsides of seed starting is, in the beginning, the first couple times you do it, it is time consuming. It's time consuming because you have to fill the trays, you have to get the seeds ready. I mean, this is minimum time that I'm talking about, but it is time consuming and takes a little bit more thought and prep than just going to the nursery, buying your plants and sticking it in the soil. So that's something to consider. The other portion is there is a slight learning curve, but luckily I'm here. We are here at San Diego Seed Company to make sure that that learning curve shortens and you have far less disasters than you could have if you didn't learn a few tips and tricks. So that's some of the upsides and downsides of starting from seed. Now, the whole presentation, that's what I'm really going to focus on, is how you do that. But I do want to talk about one other way in which you can do plant propagation, and that is via clones or cuttings. It's a very easy way to get extra plants. A lot of varieties or a lot of plants rather are easily propagated by cuttings. Tomatoes are one of them. You can simply cut it, put it in water, it will root, and then you can plant that. It's a really amazing way to produce more plants. So the upside of that is it's very cost effective. You could simply, if you have a neighbor who's growing a tomato variety you like, you could get a cutting from it and start it that way. Tomatoes, herbs are very easy to do. Berry canes are very easy to propagate. So it's really neat, and it's a fun way to trade with neighbors in the community who are gardening. And it's also neat because you will get an exact clone of the plant that you propagate. So if you take a cutting of a tomato plant, you get that exact tomato plant. It does not change when you cut it and you plant it. So it's a way of knowing exactly what you're getting. Downside. Also a little bit time consuming. Again, not super time consuming, but it takes more time and thought process. You have to cut it, let it root, transplant it. There's usually a period where you don't really want it in a lot of sun so that it can acclimate. So there is a little bit of time involved. Also a little bit of a learning curve, but we also have all the information you need to learn to do that. And I know there's lots of YouTube videos as well. Also, it is important that you only get clones from plants that are healthy, or you risk bringing other disease or insects that you may not want into your garden. So it's something to consider. Now, let's get into seed starting. What are the key things you need to know about seed starting? Well, luckily, there's only a few of them, and if you master these few elements of seed starting, you can be wildly successful. So the keys to seed starting, number one, is moisture. I cannot stress this enough. Seeds require moisture to germinate. The imbibing process of bringing moisture through the seed coat into the soil is essential for the plant to swell, break the seed coat, and move through the soil and essentially germinate. Oftentimes what I see with new growers is that they try to keep the soil moist. Maybe they don't do it that well. Maybe they let it dry out and then wet it again. And what happens is the seed will start to germinate and then it will die. So moisture is incredibly important. Now there is a caveat to that, which I will get to in the next one. So following moisture, the other thing that is very important is temperature. So plants require a general temperature to germinate. They're not going to germinate if they're not within that range of what they need. Luckily, it's a pretty wide range. If you can germinate in anything from about 70 degrees to 80 degrees, or even for things like onions, they'll easily germinate in 50 degrees, 60 and on up. Just a general temperature. But the reason why I bring this up is as you become an expert seed starter, which I'm sure you will notice that you can make things sprout a lot quicker if they have their ideal seed temperatures. Now, I know we have on our website and also we've posted on social media, and you can find online very easily guides that will give you the ideal seed temperatures for sprouting any seed, from an obscure flower seed all the way to a vegetable crop. You can find that information online. So temperature is important. Although there is leeway and you can play with it a little bit, you can make things germinate a lot quicker if you know the temperature and can create that ideal environment. Next, soil. This is very important. So when you are starting your seeds, now again, I'm talking about in trays, it's important that you use seed starting mix. I know that you can go to your garden, you can take soil out of your garden, you can put it in your trays and you can start seeds that way. That's absolutely possible. Will you have as much success doing that? No, you will not. Seed starting soil is formulated specifically for seeds to germinate quickly and without any trouble getting through the soil, and will lead to happier plants. Now, I know that there are a lot of gardeners out there who like to create their own mixes. That is great once you become a little more advanced, but if you are a beginning seed starter, I highly recommend that you take any issue that you might have with starting your seeds away by starting with seed starting mix. So important. It's usually formulated with peat moss, some type of aggregate like a perlite or vermiculite, a pH balancer because peat moss is naturally very acidic. So seed starting in straight peat moss is not going to work out very well. And it's already been formulated, it's been tried, it's been tested, it's really good stuff, it's not that expensive, and you will have so much more success. So I can't mention that enough. Now, I know what you're thinking. I've given this presentation so many times, I can read your questions before you even ask them. And I always get the question of, well, but if you're starting directly in the soil in the garden, you're not starting in seed starting mix. And you're absolutely right. However, the soil that you top your seeds with needs to be as close to a seed starting mix as possible, meaning light and fluffy so the seeds can easily pop through, needs to hold on to moisture, it can't be too acidic. All of these things matter. And we'll talk a little bit more about direct seeding further on in the presentation, but it's important to know that all of these concepts for starting seeds in a tray is applicable when you're direct seeding and will make you much more successful. So soil is important, what you start your seeds in. Lastly, next is planting depth. Planting depth is really important, and I often see for beginning gardeners, that's what they tend to make mistakes around in the very beginning. It's very easy, and I actually have, let's see here, I've got this neat little presentation thing. I don't know if you can see it, but this is the approximate planting depth, and it's really cute because I actually glued some seeds onto a cardboard. But it shows you a bean, you plant much deeper than a tiny, tiny little arugula seed. So the idea is simple. A seed has within its seed coat only enough energy to take on moisture, break through the seed coat, and then go up through the soil. The bigger the seed, the more stored energy. That means it has more energy to break through more soil. So if you take a bean plant and you plant it an inch down, it will germinate because they're very big, strong plants. Now, if you take something like a carrot seed and you plant an inch below the surface, you will never see it sprout because it simply does not have enough energy to get all the way through that soil. So that's why planting depth is really important. And a general rule of thumb is you plant about twice as deep as the width of the seed. And just take that as the bigger the seed, the deeper you can plant it. If you're having troubles with getting small seeds to sprout, that's probably the number one area. The soil that you're putting on top of the seeds is either not a thin enough layer, or there could be particles in the soil that are preventing like something as tiny as a carrot seed from sprouting. So that's the other thing that I see people make mistakes on. The next is air. Oxygen is incredibly important for seeds to germinate. They need water, but they also need air. So if you're planting in straight peat moss, for example, which is a common mistake people make, not only is it too acidic, but it could hold on to so much moisture that it will basically drown your seeds. They won't get enough oxygen, they will rot in place, and you will not get good germination. That's why with seed starting mix, there is aggregates or little pieces of perlite in it that act as little air pockets because they're jagged little pieces, and it holds air inside the soil. So it's not just a solid mass of peat moss. So all of these are very, very important. So now that we know all the basic things on how to start your seeds, where you can go wrong, what the most common mistakes are, let's talk about the actual different ways in which you can start your seeds and things that people use to make it a little bit easier. So first, we have greenhouses. Now, greenhouses, not all greenhouses need to look like this greenhouse. This is a pretty large greenhouse. Doesn't look like it's an urban area. Most people probably don't have the space for something like this. But the primary function of a greenhouse is simply to regulate moisture and temperature. So that means a greenhouse will hold in moisture, which we just learned is essential to seed starting, and it will also regulate temperature. So it will keep it a nice, 82 degrees, which will allow for very quick germination. Luckily, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish those same things. So you can simply use plastic. This is what my grandparents did. They would take their pots and they would cover them with plastic when they planted a seed. It keeps in moisture and it keeps in temperature, and the seeds will sprout a lot quicker. Now, it is important that you keep in mind that with the plastic sheets, that once the seeds germinate, that sheet needs to come off. Otherwise, you could potentially suffocate the seedling, and then all your work would be for nothing. So that's a very absolutely inexpensive way in which you can start seeds, and you'll notice you'll get quicker germination that way. Another very simple and inexpensive way is to use seedling covering trays. You can buy these at any local nursery, and basically the tray on top acts just like the plastic. Once the seeds germinate, you'll want to lift that lid up a little bit to let air flow through, and so that the plants aren't suffocating. Another option is there's all kinds of different, really neat, a little more expensive glass bowls that can go over your area that you start where you have planted the seedling. This is not as common in Southern California because we get so hot. You find this much more common in England and areas that are a lot colder. But again, I'm showing you this so that you just see what the thought process is behind these, and you might come up with something neat yourself. I've seen people actually use 2-liter pop bottles that they cut off and use that same concepts. Row covers is another neat way that you can get seeds to germinate very quickly. Row covers are also used in farming, small scale urban farming, to keep insects off. So that's another option. Again, it's just a fabric or a plastic that is kept over the area that you've planted seeds to guarantee that they're going to germinate and stay warm enough. High tunnel, this is very simple. You could do something very simple like that in any backyard garden, especially if you are planting in a raised bed. So let's talk about what this would look like. Let's say you don't want to do starts in your seed packs. You want to plant directly into your beds, but you want those seeds to germinate evenly and quickly. Well, by adding some layer of plastic over your garden beds so that the moisture is kept in, they will germinate a lot quicker. It is important to note that if it's an extremely hot day and you use black plastic, you could potentially burn your seedlings. So you need to use common sense in those areas. Next are actually greenhouse structures. If anybody is interested, there's lots of neat greenhouse structures available online that you can purchase, ranging in size and cost. Our greenhouse on our farm we built, that was the most cost effective for us, but there's lots of different options out there. So it's so important to know that regardless of what kind of greenhouse you're using, whether it's a sheet of plastic, whether it's an actual greenhouse, you need to make sure that once your seedlings sprout, that you open it up to let air flow in, and that if you keep the plastic covering over your boxes or anything like that, that you monitor for pests and fungus. Why? Because it's a warm moist environment, and those are places that pests and fungus really enjoy being. Also, ventilation is another important factor in any greenhouse. The general rule of thumb is that you want about 20% of the square footage in your greenhouse to be ventilation, meaning a window that you can open. In our greenhouse, we run a fan almost year round, but particularly in the warm season to allow for air to get through. The air actually moves the seedlings and makes them stronger as they create more plant fibers. And it's also important that you clean your greenhouse regularly, or if you're doing seed starting trays, it is very helpful if you give them a little bit of a wash in between seed starting seasons, because harmful microbes can build up over time and it actually can lead to things like dampening off, which I will talk about later on in the slide. So just good hygiene is very important. Now let's talk a little bit about soil. Soil is so much more than dirt. And whatever you put in your seed starting trays, whether it be seed starting mix or whatever you put in your raised beds, you want it to be healthy, good soil that has plenty of moisture, that has plenty of organic matter, rather, that can hold on to moisture. That is so important. You'll notice that your garden will be so much happier when you have really good soil. Over time, as you build your soil, you add organic matter and all of those things, your plants start to really thrive, and that's a product of the soil, is the most important part of your garden. So as I mentioned, propagation mix or seed starting mix, it is specifically formulated for seed starting. It's light, it's airy, it allows for seeds to easily pop through. And if you are a beginning gardener, I recommend that you use it for your trays if you're starting seeds that way. And if you are using it, if you're going to direct sow, you can actually sift with a sifter any potting mix or seed starting mix and lightly cover your seeds that way at the correct depth, and you'll notice you'll have so much more success. Your propagation mix will hold on to more moisture, which is incredibly important in Southern California. And it is also sterile, which is an important factor. Sterile soil is important when you're seed starting because there's not a lot of microbes in that soil that could potentially kill off your seedlings. Now, the reason why I have the caveat on there that says not always necessary is we recycle soil on our farm all the time. We will start seeds in fresh soil, and then that soil ends up making it, if things don't always all sprout, that soil gets tossed into a soil heap, and that heap gets put into, containers and things like that. We never toss soil, but the idea is when a seed is really small and vulnerable, we try to increase its likelihood of success the most that we can. And one way we do that is by using soil that is relatively sterile. So I'm just going to reiterate a couple more points here to make sure that everybody really understands the key factors in seed starting. Planting depth, as I mentioned, is incredibly important. And if you plant a seedling too deep, it is not going to sprout. Also, if you plant a seedling too shallow, you'll notice, like bean seeds, if you don't plant them deep enough, when they sprout, they just fall over because they haven't produced a good anchor in the soil. It's really important that you follow on any seed pack. On the back, there's recommendations that say how deep you plant your seeds. But additionally, as we learned earlier in the presentation, that you plant your seeds about twice as deep as the width of the seed. So again, with my very silly, dorky little presentation here, you can see bean seed a lot deeper than a tiny, tiny little arugula seed. So it's really important. So all of this information is here for you. You're welcome to screenshot it. Just remember it. It's really good information that will continue to help you in your gardening. So we talked about planting depth, we talked about moisture, we talked about seed starting mix, which is so incredibly important. All of those things will lead you to be a much more successful seed starter. And before too long, you'll notice that it's addicting and really fun to start your plants from seeds, and then you can trade with neighbors, you can share with neighbors, and gardening can be much less expensive. So that is our goal here at San Diego Seed Company. Is we have a campaign called A Million Urban Farmers, and we want to inspire, educate, and support a million urban farmers, because we believe urban farming is going to be just one small part of the puzzle that will help with making our communities more sustainable in the future. So thank you to all for watching the show. Thank you to OB Library for helping fund the presentation. And remember that our website is chock full of all kinds of blogs and presentations and information, and we are here to help you grow. So reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you, guys.